Some truths are buried not by time, but by the people who dare to call themselves family. It begins in a forgotten estate called Sycamore Hollow, where a slashed portrait, a broken lullaby, and a sister who never truly smiled unravel a legacy steeped in deception. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Let us follow Holmes into the silence behind the smile, where bloodlines blur and memory becomes the sharpest blade of all. It was on a morning of unusual stillness, in the waning days of November, that I found myself seated by the hearth at 221B Baker Street, the Times folded upon my lap, and the embers of the fire casting long, angular shadows across the carpet. A brittle frost had settled overnight upon the windowsill, forming delicate webs of silver filigree upon the panes, and the world beyond our quarters wore a pallid grey, muffled in a silence that even the omnipresent rattle of the hansom cabs seemed reluctant to disturb. Holmes, as was his wont on such days, lay coiled in the armchair opposite, fingers steepled, eyes closed not in sleep but in some inward meditation. He had spoken no word since breakfast, save to murmur a passing remark on the uneven soot pattern upon our chimney sweep's boots, deduced, correctly, from a trace left upon the rug. It was thus, in that suspended hush peculiar to our lodgings, when neither case nor conversation broke the air, that the bell rang, not urgently, but with a kind of hesitant firmness, and Holmes's eyes opened at once. "You will find," he said without turning, "that our visitor is no tradesman." The door swung open to admit Mrs. Hudson, her brow faintly furrowed, and behind her stepped a young lady, no more than 25, wrapped in a travel-stained cloak of dark green velvet. Her features were finely wrought, though drawn and pale as though seldom touched by sun, and her gloved hands trembled ever so slightly at her sides. There was a refinement in her bearing that spoke of gentle birth, though her eyes, grey, wide, and slightly reddened, revealed a sleeplessness that no breeding could conceal. "Miss Isabel Montague," Mrs. Hudson announced with a subtle nod, then withdrew with her usual tact. Holmes rose and inclined his head. "Pray be seated, Miss Montague. You come to us from some distance, I gather?" The young woman took the offered chair, her movements careful, almost rehearsed, as though the act of speaking in such surroundings was a strain upon her nerves. For a long moment she said nothing, only stared at the fire, and when she spoke at last her voice was low and measured, yet coloured by a kind of fragile urgency. "I do not know if I bring a matter for Scotland Yard, or for your peculiar talents, Mr. Holmes. I only know that I can no longer sleep in that house, and that I must speak before silence destroys us all." Holmes did not reply at once. His gaze rested on the visitor with that unerring concentration I had come to know, less curiosity than calibration, as though noting not only what was said, but what was restrained. "My home," she began, her eyes still upon the hearth, "is called Sycamore Hollow. It lies 2 miles north of a marsh brook, a secluded manor set back behind overgrown hedgerows and the remains of a stone orchard wall. We, my sisters and I, have lived there since our father's death nearly 2 years ago. I am the second of 4 daughters. Judith was the eldest." She paused on that name as though it lingered differently on her tongue. "She died last month. They say it was natural causes. Her door was locked from within, the windows bolted, the fire burnt low in the grate. When Clara, my younger sister, found her the next morning, Judith lay upon her bed with the lamp still burning beside her, her face altered, but there was no mark, no wound. The doctor said it was her heart." She glanced towards Holmes as if expecting dismissal, but he only inclined his head slightly, inviting her to continue. "And yet, Mr. Holmes," she went on, more softly now, "in the weeks before her death, Judith had grown unsettled. She said someone was walking the halls at night, that she could hear breathing, not her own, outside her door. We all laughed at first. The manor has its creaks and murmurs, as old houses do. But one evening, I heard it too, her hands clenched unconsciously in her lap. It stopped when I opened my door. There was no one there, only cold air and silence. Judith's face the next morning was drawn as though she hadn't slept at all. 3 days later, she was dead. Holmes did not interrupt her silence but watched her with sharpened attention. He glanced briefly at me before folding his hands beneath his chin, his eyes gleaming with that curious stillness which always heralded a case of particular interest. After our father passed, she continued, gathering herself, his will was read by the family solicitor. It stated that his estate, Sycamore Hollow, the land, the accounts, was to be divided equally among his daughters. Yet, there was a stipulation. Only 3 names were ever recorded. Holmes arched an eyebrow. You are 4. Yes, and no name was omitted. It simply referred to the 3 daughters of my blood. No one ever questioned it while father lived. We were raised together, treated equally, yet we understood, somehow, that something lingered unspoken. I frowned. Did your father ever speak of this difference? Never directly, she replied, but there were whispers among the servants once. Old letters never shown. One winter, a nurse visited for a fortnight and never returned. We were children then. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice very quiet. Which of you was born last, Miss Montague? Eliza, she said, and her tone faltered for the first time. She has been unwell for years, confined to a wheeled chair. She rarely speaks of the past. There was a silence between us, heavy and deliberate. Holmes steepled his fingers once more, but his gaze had already moved beyond the facts and toward whatever lay beneath them. Judith was not a fanciful woman, Miss Montague resumed, her voice steadier now, as though unburdened by each passing detail. She was the most rational among us. If she feared something, it was not imagination. She looked toward Holmes directly. In her final week, she refused to leave her room after sunset. She claimed the footsteps were not random. She said they paused at each door, as though counting. She even accused someone of entering her room without opening the door. Her room had no second entrance? I asked. None, Doctor. The window locks had not been touched, and the door was always locked from within when she slept. A sliding panel? Holmes asked. Not to our knowledge. The house is old, certainly, but the walls are stone, and the passages narrow. There are whispers of priest holes, but none have been found. Holmes nodded slowly. One night, Isabel added in a quieter tone, Clara swore she heard a tune being hummed outside her chamber, a lullaby, the same one our governess used to sing before she was dismissed in some haste. And Eliza? Holmes asked. She says she sleeps soundly. She claims to hear nothing at all. There was something in her voice then, not accusation, not even fear, but the hushed certainty of one who dares not speak suspicion aloud, lest it bring ruin. For some moments after her words faded, there was no sound save for the faint pop of the fire and the ticking of the mantel clock. Holmes's gaze had fixed itself upon the Persian rug beneath his feet, but I knew him well enough to recognize the flurry of thought beneath that apparent stillness. At length he spoke, his voice cool and deliberate. You believe, Miss Montague, that your sister was murdered, yet you have no weapon, no wound, no opportunity for the crime. You suspect, perhaps, that she was frightened to death by something intangible, and that whatever visited her in the night may not yet be finished with your family. Isabel nodded once, her expression unreadable. Holmes stood. Watson, I believe we must arrange for a few days' absence from London. I should like to see Sycamore Hollow with my own eyes, and more particularly, the room in which Miss Judith Montague last drew breath. I rose without hesitation. Miss Montague stood as well, a glint of some dark mixture, relief, dread, hope crossing her features. A case, Holmes murmured as he retrieved his coat, where there is, as yet, no crime. And that is precisely what makes it worth our attention. Our departure from Baker Street was made under a curtain of fine mist, which clung to the cobblestones like reluctant breath. The further we journeyed into the countryside, the more oppressive the silence seemed to grow, as though the very trees leaned inward with secrets. The train bore us first through the pale outskirts of the city, then into the muted expanses of farmland, where hedge and hedgerow passed like mourners at a slow procession. Holmes said little throughout, his gaze fixed upon the shifting terrain. When he did speak, it was only to observe the slight backward slant of chimneys in the northern counties, no doubt due to the prevailing winds, and how such a detail might influence the dispersal of chimney smoke in forensic analysis. I responded out of habit, but found myself increasingly preoccupied by the letter that had brought us here. Miss Montague's voice lingered with me, calm, rational, yet edged with something close to despair. We arrived in the hamlet of Marchbrook beneath a sky now burnished to dull pewter. A carriage awaited us, driven by a coachman of few words, who spoke the name Sycamore Hollow, as though it required no introduction. As we made our way along the winding lanes, Holmes leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing at the first glimpse of the house, a brooding structure of grey stone, set back from the road and half choked by overgrown ivy. One turret rose askew, its roof missing slates, and the great oaken door stood dark as pitch. "It is not often," Holmes remarked softly, "that the setting offers such faithful companionship to the tale." We were received not by servants, but by Miss Isabel Montague herself, who met us in the entrance hall with an expression curiously divided between relief and hesitation. She led us swiftly through the chill interior, its corridors long and silent, the walls adorned with stern ancestral portraits in oils. There was no fire lit in the hall, and a faint scent of lavender hung in the air, too faint to comfort, but strong enough to notice. "This way," she said, and gestured us into a parlour dimly lit by a solitary window. There we met the remaining sisters. Clara Montague stood nearest the hearth, her hands clasped before her in a fashion that betrayed a lifelong habit of restraint. She was plainly dressed, with little to mark her apart from the 1,000 other modest daughters of English country homes. But there was something in her stillness, in the way her eyes flickered nervously to the corners of the room, that suggested a spirit not at rest. She offered only a polite nod upon our introduction, then quickly withdrew to the chair nearest the window, resuming what I later realised was a posture of silent observation. Eliza Montague was a contrast of another order. Seated in a wheeled chair of dark mahogany, she appeared almost spectral, her features bloodless, her gaze fixed not upon Holmes or myself, but somewhere indeterminate, as if she listened to something internal and unwelcome. Her hands rested on the arms of the chair, unmoving, the nails trimmed to perfection, the skin translucent. Beside her stood Mr. Fenley, the caretaker, who inclined his head but said nothing. He was a man of middle years, well-kept and expressionless, with the bearing of someone long in service and determined not to overstep his boundary. Holmes greeted them all with the same civility he might have employed at a diplomatic breakfast, yet I could tell he noted every tick, every pause, every glance withheld. "I should like to see Judith's room," Holmes said without delay, once the preliminary introductions had ebbed into an uneasy quiet. His tone was firm but unhurried, as though the matter were already decided. Miss Isabel looked to Mr. Fenley, who gave a stiff nod and stepped forward, leading us to the eastern wing. There the atmosphere seemed to grow more oppressive still, the air curiously stagnant despite the apparent absence of dust. We came at last to a heavy, walnut door bearing no ornamentation, its brass handle dulled with age. "It has not been opened since her passing," Isabel said softly, "by my request." Holmes studied the frame. "Good. Then I shall be the first to disturb what has settled here." He ran one finger along the edge of the door, then along the keyhole, which bore the faintest glint of soot, as if touched by a candle held too close in haste. He straightened. "I shall require the key when the time is proper," he said, "but not yet. First, I must see the shape of the house and how its silences are arranged. With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving the sealed door behind like an unopened question. I followed, though with a lingering glance at the untouched handle, and the strange weight that seemed to hang about that quiet passage. We had not long departed from the sealed chamber when Holmes, rather than return to the parlour, stepped lightly through a side corridor and into the garden beyond the eastern wing. The November light had grown listless, casting an odd violet hue upon the gravel paths and leaving the ivy-clad walls in uneasy half-shadow. I followed him through the frost-laced underbrush, where weeds had begun to overtake what once might have been formal hedging. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, pausing by the French windows that led into Judith's suite. He bent, brushing aside a crumbling trail of leaves. Upon the flagstones below the sill lay a faint but distinct series of impressions. Bare footprints, not those of a man's boot or woman's slipper, but of naked feet, small and strangely angled. The soot smeared across their outlines suggested they had passed through some residue from the chimney stack, or more curiously, the hearth. "They are not the prints of someone walking naturally," Holmes observed. "Note the forward tilt of the pressure here and here. These were made by someone walking on the balls of the feet, as though attempting silence or performance." He drew a finger lightly along one of the marks. "And yet no servant has confessed to entering this part of the garden since Judith's death. The window above has not been opened. Tell me, Watson, how does a barefoot figure leave soot beneath a locked window in the garden of a household where none walk unshod?" I had no answer. Holmes straightened slowly, his eyes fixed upon the upper casement. "The theatre of this house is not within," he said softly. "It plays upon the stones beneath it." The dusk had settled more deeply by the time we re-entered the house. Holmes excused himself to examine the base of the northern chimney, leaving me momentarily alone in the drawing room. It was there that Clara Montague, drawn by some invisible thread of unease, approached me with a hesitance I had not seen earlier. "I saw you in the garden," she said softly. "You looked as though you were searching for something." I nodded, though uncertain what she sought to confirm. "I hear them too," she whispered, eyes fixed on the unlit hearth. "At night. Steps. Always just past the door. I rise, I listen, but when I open it, nothing. No creak of retreat. No flicker of candlelight. Only stillness." Her hands twisted in her lap. "Isabel says I imagine it. Eliza says I dream. But I know when a presence breathes near me, even if it speaks no word. I know." Her voice caught, then steadied. "They say Judith began with such imaginings, that she began to sleep with her lamp burning." I placed a hand gently atop hers, more for reassurance than inquiry, yet something in her gaze, as though she dared not blink, told me she was not seeking comfort, she was seeking witness. Shortly thereafter, Holmes returned, his boots dusted faintly with soot and his fingers stained from brickwork. Mr. Fenley was summoned and joined us in the small study, where Holmes had arranged 3 chairs in a deliberate triangle, leaving the 4th empty. Fenley entered with measured gait and impeccable grooming, his boots without a blemish, his nails glistening as though recently oiled. He took his place without hesitation. "Mr. Fenley," Holmes began evenly, "you have served the Montague family, I believe, since Miss Isabel's childhood." "That is correct, sir. 21 years last August. And in that time, you have seen the house undergo little alteration?" "None significant, sir." "Then you would be familiar with its draughts, its floorboards, its more eccentric murmurs." Fenley allowed a small smile. "An old house, Mr. Holmes, is like an old woman, full of sighs and complaints, but rarely secrets." Holmes's expression did not change. "And the prints by the east window?" "I saw none, sir." "Because you never looked, or because they were not there when last you passed?" The caretaker's pause was brief but not unnoticed. I seldom visit the East Side. It unsettled the late Miss Judith. I respected her wish for solitude. Holmes leaned back. And Eliza? He asked softly. She is always in her chair. Of course, Fenley replied quickly. She has no strength to stand, let alone walk. Holmes nodded, but his gaze lingered a moment longer on the man's polished hands, hands that bore no soot. That evening, after the lamps were dimmed, and the house lay in a hush broken only by the soft sigh of settling timbers, Holmes and I walked the upper corridor in silence. The hall was narrow, the floor uneven, and each door we passed seemed to close with a different voice. One with a hollow thud, another with a faint groan, another still with a peculiar rustling, like fingers drawn over parchment. Holmes paused before one in particular. Clara's room, I believe, and tilted his head. Listen, he said. The whisper lies not in what is said, but in what it resists saying. He took 2 steps back and looked at the wall opposite. This house, he murmured, was not built for comfort, nor even for grandeur. It was built for watching. And within it, someone always is. With that, he turned away, and we returned to our chambers, though I confess I did not sleep. Our return to the drawing room was met not by silence, but by something more unsettling still, a sense of deliberate absence. Holmes, who had paused just within the threshold, raised his hand slightly to arrest my step. His gaze had fixed upon the far wall where a large oil portrait had once hung, its outline still faintly visible in the dust-darkened wallpaper. The frame remained, but what it contained now bore no resemblance to honour or memory. The canvas had been slashed, crudely and with violent purpose, across the region of the mouth and eyes. The lips, once delicately painted in a faint smile, were now riven in two by a jagged diagonal tear. The eyes, those common foci of reverence in portraiture, had been obliterated by a downward stroke that seemed too purposeful for mere accident. Holmes approached without a word and studied the destruction in silence. Then, with a finger, he gently touched the lower right corner of the canvas, where flecks of ash clung to the dried paint. Judith Montague, he said softly, or rather, her impression of how she wished to be remembered. I stepped closer, and someone could not bear the sight of it. No, Watson, he murmured. Someone could not bear the lie it preserved. We proceeded then to the chamber that had remained sealed since Judith's death. The key was produced without protest by Miss Isabel, though her hand trembled as she passed it to Holmes. The unlocking of the door was a quiet act, but it seemed to echo through the corridor like a bell tolling for something long buried. Within, the air held that peculiar blend of neglect and perfume, lavender, faint again, but insistent, as though applied habitually even in solitude. The curtains were drawn, and Holmes opened them only slightly, permitting a dim wash of winter light to cast angular shadows across the furnishings. The room was spare, but not cold. It bore the touches of its inhabitant's will, a silver-handled hairbrush upon the vanity, a closed volume of Tennyson on the nightstand, a black lace shawl folded with unnatural care upon a chair. It was a room not of peace, but of preparation, deliberate, as though its occupant had tidied for a guest who never arrived. Holmes moved slowly, his fingers never touching, only tracing the air before objects as though they bore stories in vapour. Nothing has been disturbed, I said, half to myself. On the contrary, Holmes replied, everything has been arranged. He paused beside the fireplace, then turned his attention to the floor. The fire was drawn low before death, he murmured. She intended rest, yet the lamp remained lit, and the window, still locked from within. He turned then toward the bed, where the blankets lay folded at the corners, but the pillow bore the faint hollow of a final head. It was Holmes who noticed the teacup. It lay beside the bed, its rim chipped, its contents long dried into a pale yellow residue that clung to the inner curve. The saucer rested just beneath it, as if caught in the act of falling, but arrested by the carpeting's resistance. Holmes lifted the cup delicately and offered it to me. Your medical expertise, Watson. What do you make of the substance here? I examined it with care, dabbing a fingertip to the residue before bringing it cautiously to the nose. Not bitter, I observed, but unmistakably chemical. Chloral hydrate, I believe. A sedative, harmless in small doses, but capable of producing deep sleep. Holmes nodded. Judith was not poisoned, nor was she drugged without her knowledge. She took this knowingly, or so it would seem. I frowned. Then what are we to suppose? That she desired rest and did not wake? She desired to escape something, Holmes replied. Or someone. He turned toward the hearth. But there is no cup for the morning's tea, no tray, no second serving. She was alone. And yet, he gestured toward the bed frame's iron rail. If she collapsed, she did not do so in panic. If she drank, she did not do so in despair. But then, why the cup overturned? I glanced again at the scene. It was too ordered, too deliberate. Holmes lowered his voice. A protest, Watson. A message left not with words, but with porcelain. We emerged from the chamber to find Clara Montague seated alone in the corridor, her hands resting in her lap, like pale birds folded in stillness. She looked up as we approached, and Holmes, with that curious gentleness he reserved for the emotionally afflicted, asked if she might walk with us for a moment. We descended to the lower parlour, where the fire had been newly kindled, though no one seemed to have sat before it. Holmes remained standing, his silhouette cut starkly against the mantel. Miss Clara, he said, your sister's room is precisely as she left it, and yet she did not leave it as she lived. She left it as a statement. Clara's eyes flickered. Then you believe she knew? I believe she suspected. She looked down at her hands. A moment passed before she spoke again, and when she did, it was in a voice stripped of ornament. Papa's will, she said. It named only 3 daughters. Holmes inclined his head. But there are 4 of you. She nodded. We never questioned it, or rather, we were taught not to question it. One of us, he said, was never meant to marry, never to leave, never to inherit. But he never said which. And did you believe he meant Eliza? Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. She believed he did. But Judith feared it had been her. There was a silence, heavy and strange. Then Holmes turned back toward the staircase. Perhaps, he said, the answer is not in what was written, but in what was left unwritten. We returned once more to Judith's chamber, Holmes with a small blade and a magnifying lens in hand. He knelt at the foot of the bed, where the carpet met the hearthstone, and lifted a corner of the rug with delicate care. What he revealed was curious indeed. Beneath the fabric, embedded in the grain of the floorboards, was a faint but unmistakable mark, a narrow, linear scorch, barely visible except where the varnish had bubbled ever so slightly. It extended in a thin arc from beneath the bed to the wall, where it disappeared behind the skirting board. Holmes examined it silently for some moments. Then he stood and crossed to the opposite wall, where he tapped gently at the wood panelling. There is a cavity behind this, he said, a shallow one, perhaps a vent, perhaps something more purposeful. I looked again at the mark on the floor. What could cause such a scorch? Not a candle, nor coal. Something warm, but not a flame, Holmes replied. Something passed beneath her bed. Or someone. The notion chilled me. Are you suggesting that someone entered her room from beneath? I suggest nothing, Holmes said coolly. But I begin to see the outline of a mechanism. An old one, perhaps long disused, but capable still of accommodating a visitor with knowledge of its design. He straightened, his expression unreadable. Miss Judith was not alone, he said. She was observed. We descended the staircase once more, the house now steeped in the peculiar hush that follows a disturbance not yet understood. In the parlour, the 3 remaining sisters had resumed their usual places, though none spoke. Eliza sat in her chair, motionless and remote. Clara watched the fire, as if deciphering omens in its flicker. Isabel, the most composed, wore the expression of one waiting not for an answer, but for a verdict. Holmes stood in the doorway for some minutes before joining me at the window. He did not speak at first. Then softly, as if to himself, "The walls here carry more than memory, Watson. They bear witness to a silence curated, not from ignorance, but from choice." He turned his gaze upon the sisters. They have lived in proximity so long, they no longer ask questions. Each preserves her corner of the truth, convinced that to disturb the others would unravel the fragile fabric between them. He picked a fleck of ash from his sleeve and watched it drift to the sill. "The fire left more than smoke," he murmured. "The walls are not the only things that are fire-marked." It was not long past the 2nd hour when I awoke, though not by dream or discomfort. Rather, it was a sound, subtle, deliberate, that roused me from uneasy slumber. The fire in our chamber had reduced itself to a thin, orange filament in the grate, and the frost upon the window panes had grown denser since nightfall. I lay still, the sheet pulled to my chin, listening. It came again, a soft rattle, not the violent turning of a knob, nor the jarring creak of a heavy door flung open, but something more insidious, the slow, tentative shiver of a handle as though turned and released by a trembling hand. It seemed to come from somewhere down the corridor, though the muffled timber of these old manor walls made distances deceptive. Holmes, in the bed opposite, did not stir. Either he had heard and chosen stillness, or, more likely, had already heard and was waiting. I rose, padded softly to the door, and placed an ear to the panel. There was no sound. But as I turned the handle, I found it move freely, and the corridor beyond stretched out into chill darkness. I stepped out, the air biting against my bare neck, and listened again. The house had settled into silence, yet I could not shake the impression that the very floor beneath my feet remembered a presence that had passed only moments before. Silent, careful, and deeply unwelcome. I had scarcely taken a step into the hallway when I heard it. A voice, light, almost girlish, rose into the hush like a breath loosed from an unseen mouth. It came not from above or below, but seemed to hover at the midpoint of the corridor, neither advancing nor receding. The tune was faint but recognizable. A lullaby, English in origin, one I had not heard in decades and yet found oddly familiar. There was no accompaniment, only the voice, gentle and wavering, repeating the same half-verse in a tone that carried neither cheer nor grief, but something in between, something terribly calm. I held my breath. The melody grew stronger for a moment, as if approaching, then faltered, as though caught in the throat. A pause, and then nothing. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence, but of the sort one experiences in the instant a candle gutters out. It felt not like the absence of sound, but the active withdrawal of it. I looked behind me. The hallway remained unchanged, and no shadow passed the sconce. Holmes's door remained closed. The faint scent of wax and soot lingered in the air, as though someone had just extinguished a taper. The effect upon me was one I cannot fully articulate. It was not fear, precisely, but a creeping unease that settled itself not in the stomach but along the spine. A melody should not vanish like that, not without leaving an echo behind. And yet, the air was still. Compelled by equal parts instinct and apprehension, I moved cautiously along the hallway. My steps made scarcely a whisper upon the runner, yet I felt exposed in the narrowness of that passage, as though each step forward invited a gaze from some unseen vantage. When I reached the landing where the corridor split to encircle the central stairwell, I paused. uncertain whether to descend or return. It was then that I saw her, or rather, it. At the far end of the hall, just beyond the shaft of moonlight cast by the leaded glass, stood a slight figure, too small for a man, too tall for a child, motionless and faintly luminous. The posture was erect, the shoulders squared. I could discern no face, nor clothing, only the impression of form against shadow, and the subtle outline of what might have been long hair falling across one shoulder. The figure did not move. I stepped forward once, and in that instant it slipped behind the column at the corridor's end, noiseless as smoke, vanishing entirely from view. I rushed forward, heart quickened now, but when I reached the point, there was nothing. No creak of a door, no whisper of feet, no shift in the air to suggest breath or body. Only the long hallway stretching into dark, and the faint creaking of the old beams settling above me. I stood there for some time, unwilling to call out, unwilling to return. I knew only that something had been watching, and had chosen, for now, not to speak. When morning came, grey, quiet and cold, I found Holmes already awake and dressed, standing at the end of the corridor as though he had been there for hours. His silhouette, sharpened by the early light, had something statuesque in it, a figure awaiting not dawn, but disclosure. He did not speak when I joined him, but gestured silently to the skirting along the eastern wall. There, scarcely visible except to one trained in such things, was a faint compression in the wood, no larger than a thumb's width but repeating at irregular intervals as if under light, repeated pressure. Not footfalls, Holmes said at last. Too shallow, too narrow, but consistent. You see the interruption there, just beside Judith's room. I bent to look. A line in the skirting was broken by a subtle change in colour and grain, an uneven seam perhaps, or the ghost of a once concealed fitting. Holmes removed a match from his coat pocket, struck it with a deliberate gesture, and held it near the baseboard. Almost at once the flame flickered, pulled not upward, but laterally, toward the wall itself. There, he said. Feel it. The air shifts, cold, dry, directional. I did as he instructed and felt it, a current, no broader than a finger, slipping through the stone as though exhaled by the house itself. Holmes straightened. Air does not pass through stone unless invited. Something breathes behind this wall, and where air travels, so too may other things. He tapped once against the skirting, then turned toward Judith's chamber again, his steps unhurried, his mind clearly elsewhere. With a quiet determination, Holmes returned to Judith's room and approached the wall directly behind her bed. His eyes moved along the moulding, his fingertips following the faint variations in texture and alignment. He paused before a narrow section of panelling that, to my eye, appeared no different than any other, yet which drew his attention with the confidence of one who listens for what cannot be heard. He reached into his coat and withdrew a slim, worn blade, the same he had used years before to open the sealed dispatch box of the late Colonel Fitzwalter, and slid it gently along the rightmost seam. A soft click followed. The panel gave way by no more than an inch, but it was enough. Holmes stepped back and drew it fully open. Behind the false wall lay a narrow passage, no taller than 5 feet, lined in old dust and cobwebs, the timbers dry and grey with age. It ran not into open space, but between the walls, a servant's crawl space, long forgotten or deliberately hidden. It runs the length of the east wing, Holmes observed. 4 bedrooms in all, Judith's, Clara's, Isabel's, and Eliza's. He crouched and ran his hand along the inner frame. No recent prints, but the dust is disturbed. The air is stale but breathable. It has been used. I felt a shiver, though not from the cold. Someone has walked these walls in silence, Holmes murmured, with the house itself as accomplice. And last night, Watson, you heard them singing. It was later that morning, as we sat before the fire. and Holmes idly hummed a half-remembered fragment of the lullaby I had heard in the corridor, that Clara, passing behind him, froze mid-step. Her hand went to the mantel for support. Her face had lost all colour. "That song," she whispered. "Please, don't sing it here." Holmes turned. "You recognise it?" She nodded once, her voice brittle. "It was Judith's favourite. Our governess used to sing it. But Judith stopped after—" She broke off. Holmes waited. She said the mirror changed when she sang, that her reflection no longer moved with her. "She believed she saw something else?" I asked. Clara nodded slowly. Something behind her eyes that wasn't hers. She did not elaborate further, and Holmes, with a soft word of apology, ceased his humming. But I saw him glance toward the mirror that hung above the hearth, and his expression was not one of superstition, but of calculation. Before luncheon, Holmes paid a quiet visit to Eliza's quarters. She greeted him with her usual composure, seated in her chair, her pale hands folded neatly atop a silk shawl. "I seldom stir from here," she said, unprompted, "but I find I do not miss the world." Holmes nodded politely, then lowered his gaze. The wheels of her chair bore faint streaks of damp, the sort found on flagstones exposed to morning dew, and a nearly imperceptible scratch marred the floor just outside the door. Holmes said nothing, but when he turned to leave, I caught the briefest flicker of satisfaction cross his face. The morning wore on in a hush that felt neither restful nor ordinary. I found Holmes alone in the drawing room, seated at the old upright piano that stood beneath the eastern window, a piece of handsome but neglected craftsmanship that no one in the household appeared to favour. The cover was closed, the ivory keys yellowed with disuse, and one leg of the stool was wedged with a folded handkerchief to balance its list. I was about to remark on the absurdity of Holmes at a musical instrument when I noticed that he was not seated in contemplation, but scrutiny. His gaze had fixed upon the upper back panel of the piano, just beneath the curved housing of the string frame. "You see, Watson," he said without looking at me, "even age has a grammar, and when a sentence is interrupted, one ought to ask by what hand." He pointed to the rear veneer. There, along the inside edge, I perceived a series of minute abrasions. No more than pinpricks to the untrained eye, but to Holmes they spoke volumes. "Tool marks," he explained. "Delicate, cautious, made by a blade finer than a dinner knife, but broader than a letter opener." He inserted his fingers into a seam I had not known to exist, and with gentle pressure, the panel clicked back an inch. From within, he drew a sealed envelope, yellowed, waxed, but miraculously intact. There was no address, no stamp, no fold. It had never seen a postbag. Holmes examined the seal. "Broken and resealed," he murmured, "not by a thief, but by someone who read, then returned it to darkness." He handed it to me. "Would you do the honour, Watson? I suspect the voice within prefers to speak to you." The envelope, though unmarked without, contained a single sheet of thick paper, folded once, and without creases. As I unfolded it, the faint scent of cedar rose, perhaps from the drawer in which it had been stored, or perhaps from the very desk of the man who had penned it. The hand was that of an older gentleman, firm yet reserved, suggesting both age and restraint. There was no salutation, no signature, merely a direct address, as if the letter were meant not for posterity, but for a singular moment of truth. "To my true daughter, you must forgive the silence that has been your only inheritance from me. Men do what they can with the tools they are given, and I was not made for confessions. But it is unjust to die without one. You were always first to speak, first to see what others missed. And had I been braver, you might have known the place you were meant to hold. But I built a house of balance, not of love. And to preserve its symmetry, I named only 3. If this finds you, then you are strong enough to claim what was yours. But understand, Your sisters knew only what I permitted them to see. No blame lies with them. You are not the fourth, my child. You are the first." The letter ended without date or name. Only the dried echo of emotion pressed between its final lines. I looked up from the page. Holmes had said nothing while I read, but now his gaze was upon the hearth. "He meant to burn it," I said quietly. Holmes nodded, and then, perhaps, he could not. A clock ticked somewhere behind us. In that moment, the drawing room felt not like a place of parlour conversation, but of confession, interrupted. Holmes rose and crossed to the fireplace, where the grate bore only the remnants of last night's embers. He crouched and examined the ironwork with his usual precision, his fingers brushing the ash like a reader skimming forgotten words. "No remains of paper," he said. "No signs of burnt parchment. No globules of sealing wax. No charcoal flecks fine enough to suggest a private immolation." He stood and gestured toward the envelope. "The paper is thick. Rag stock of a kind not used in business correspondence. It would not have incinerated cleanly. And yet, it remains." He returned to the piano and examined the hidden recess again. "Note the way it was concealed, not with haste, but deliberation. The panel was not forced. It was fashioned to open." "You mean he intended to hide it?" I asked. "Intended to keep it accessible," Holmes corrected, "but not immediately so. A letter meant to be found, perhaps after death, or in some imagined reckoning, but not by accident." He lifted the envelope once more and turned it in the light. No date, no name. The writer did not intend it to serve a legal function, only a moral one. "And yet its content," I said slowly, "upends the legal entirely." Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed, Watson, our puzzle has shifted. We have been seeking the weakest of four sisters, but now it seems one of them was never a sister at all." And with that, he turned toward the hall, where quiet footsteps echoed in the distance, bearing, perhaps, someone who had already read the words we had just uncovered. Holmes remained for a long time beside the hearth, his gaze fixed not on the flames, but upon some mental tableau forming in his mind's eye. Then, with that sudden clarity of movement which always signalled the crystallization of a theory, he turned sharply toward the staircase and ascended without a word. I followed. Clara Montague sat alone in the corridor, her shoulders hunched and her expression vacant, as though she had aged in hours rather than years. Holmes approached her not with courtesy, but with precision. "Miss Clara," he began, "in this house there once lived someone who did not belong." Clara looked up, startled. "You mean—" "I mean a servant, one unrecorded or deliberately forgotten, a woman who came only briefly, but whose presence altered the course of this household." Clara's hands tightened in her lap. I don't remember her name, but you remember her presence." She hesitated. "It was one winter. We were very young. Judith had the fever. Papa said we must have someone who understood delicate matters. There was a woman, but she was never introduced properly. She came and went in secret. Her name? I think it was Daltrey. Mrs. Daltrey." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "She was a midwife." Clara nodded faintly. "Papa said she was there for Eliza, but I never saw her enter Eliza's room, only Father's study." "And afterward?" "She was sent away. I never saw her again." Holmes rose slowly. "Some presences leave no name, but they echo longer than memory allows." Holmes wasted no further time. With the name secured, he requested Mr. Fenley's presence under the pretext of discussing Judith's household accounts. But it was clear from the moment the caretaker entered that Holmes's true purpose was known. Fenley stood erect, his boots spotless, the buttons of his waistcoat glinting in the firelight. Holmes, seated with steepled fingers, said nothing for a long moment. "Tell me about Mrs. Daltrey," he said at last. The name landed like a dropped weight in the silence. Fenley's face remained composed, but the colour beneath his collar rose a shade. "I do not recall the name," he replied. "I believe you do." Fenley shifted. "It was before my full tenure. I was in service, but not privy to family affairs." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "A woman who entered by the back, stayed 3 days, and departed in silence, yet whose name has vanished from every record. That kind of discretion is not natural, Mr. Fenley. It is curated." Fenley said nothing, but his hands, clasped before him, had begun to tremble. Holmes stood. "Let us not pretend, sir. You were the one tasked with driving her to the station." The caretaker's mouth twitched, and a faint clenching of the jaw betrayed the effort of suppression. "She was not a nurse," Holmes said. "She was a midwife. She came for a birth, not a death." Fenley's lips parted, but no sound emerged. At last, he bowed his head. "I only did what I was paid to do. And now," Holmes replied quietly, "so must I." That evening, beneath the ancestral portrait of Richard Montague, the house's founder and patriarch whose likeness had presided for a century over Sycamore Hollow's solemn foyer, Holmes summoned all present members of the household. The sisters came as called: Isabel, her composure flickering but not undone; Clara, pale and trembling; and Eliza, wheeled by Fenley, who avoided Holmes's gaze entirely. We stood at the base of the staircase. The fire in the drawing room hissed in the distance. Outside, a mist pressed faintly against the leaded windows. Holmes did not begin with pleasantries. "I have read your father's hidden letter," he said, "and I have spoken with those who remember what some here would rather forget." He turned to face the 3 women. "One of you is not a daughter of Richard Montague. You are the daughter of his brother, or so he believed, and were taken in under the guise of kinship, raised in silence and shadow, and denied any legal inheritance." Clara let out a soft gasp. Isabel remained still. Holmes's gaze fell on Eliza. "Judith knew," he said, "and it destroyed her. She recognized what the will implied, that someone in this house had lived a life of inclusion, only to be discarded by a sentence of omission." Eliza's face did not change, but her hands moved upon the arms of her chair, gripping too tightly for infirmity. "Judith's death was not an act of mercy, nor even malice," Holmes continued. "It was, above all else, an act of preemption, a protection of the illusion she could not bear to see undone." He stepped forward. "But the illusion has already fallen. The name you never bore is less important than the truth you always lived. And that truth, Miss Eliza—" He paused, then delivered the final line with solemn clarity, "is that you are not the 4th. You were never counted at all." And in the silence that followed, no one, least of all Eliza, offered a word to the contrary. It was Holmes's particular genius that he understood not only how to dissect events, but how to recompose them into theatre. That morning, after a brief and private word with Clara, and a firmer one with Fenley, he summoned the entire household into the drawing room. The large space, with its panelling darkened by decades of oil and tobacco, had once been meant for musical evenings and seasonal receptions. But that day, under Holmes's command, it became something altogether different, a tribunal of memory and misdirection. He spent several minutes arranging 3 chairs in a semicircle facing the fireplace. Judith's diary, closed and tied with a black ribbon, lay upon a side table beside her teacup, now scrubbed clean but resting in precisely the same place as it had stood on the evening of her death. Holmes instructed Fenley to draw the drapes to their evening position and lit the candles in the candelabra, dimming the overhead sconces. Though it was barely midday, the room took on the aspect of twilight. Miss Isabel entered first, proud and unspeaking, followed by Clara, whose face bore the look of one braced for disintegration. Eliza arrived last, wheeled in silently by Fenley, her shawl folded neatly around her and her hands unmoving on her lap. Holmes stood before them, neither threatening nor deferential, but with the quiet authority of one who knew the denouement was near. "Ladies," he began, "I have asked you here not merely to present conclusions, but to restore what time and silence have effaced. Truth, in this house, was not lost. It was hidden. Let us now, together, unhide it." There was no protest, only the weight of the portraits overhead, ancestors gazing impassively upon a theatre they had not consented to attend. Holmes gestured toward me, and I stepped forward with the small leather-bound diary in my hand. The ribbon slipped loose as I opened it to the marked page. Judith's final entry, dated 2 days prior to her fall. "He cannot take what was never his," I read aloud, my voice steady, though the air seemed to grow heavier with each word. "If I have no name, then I shall have no chains. Clara must not see the letter. Eliza will not understand. But the truth must leave with someone who still has legs to carry it." There followed a blot of ink and a space, as if she had paused to listen for a sound, then resumed, shakier. "Tonight I shall not drink alone." I closed the volume. Holmes took up the teacup from the side table and set it carefully by the narrow window ledge. "The same position," he said quietly, "where Fenley found it. But it was not Judith who placed it there." He walked to the carpet near the foot of the bed, pointing with his cane. "Here, the imprint of wheels, pressed not with the weight of a seated woman, but an empty chair pushed in haste." He then turned to the bed frame. "This groove, narrow, precise, is consistent with pressure applied from below, not from a fall, from a calculated shove." Holmes stepped back into the centre of the room. "Judith did not trip. She was pushed. And the one who pushed her knew the path not seen by guests or kin, a route that threads behind this very room. I believe the moment has come to recall it." He placed his hand lightly upon the bookshelf, fingers trailing the edge until they paused at an almost imperceptible notch. And then, without ceremony, he pressed inward. With a muted creak and a puff of musty air, the bookshelf gave way, swinging forward on a concealed hinge. Behind it yawned a narrow aperture, black as pitch, lined with dust and faint cobwebs, a crawl space untouched by domestic routines, and forgotten by most who walked the halls. For a moment, none spoke. The only sound was the whisper of the draught now threading into the parlour, carrying with it the scent of wood, time, and something faintly medicinal. Then, movement. From within the darkness, a shape began to emerge. Slowly, cautiously, a figure advanced into the drawing room. It was slight of build, clad in the faded uniform of a servant, and hunched with the posture of one unused to daylight or confrontation. Gasps rang from the assembled. Clara stood sharply, clutching the arm of her chair. Eliza's eyes, for the first time since I had known her, opened wide and fixed, not with fear, but something closer to recognition. The woman, older than any of us had supposed, her face lined and hands trembling, said nothing, but she held in her arms a scrap of blue cloth, stitched at the hem with initials that did not match any among the sisters. Holmes stepped forward. "Mrs. Daltrey," he said evenly. The figure nodded once. "This house remembers you," he continued. "And now, at last, you must speak the truth it buried." The silence which followed was not empty, but heavy, thick with the weight of things long unsaid, and now impossible to unsee. The gasp which followed Mrs. Daltrey's emergence had scarcely faded, when another, deeper silence fell, one that seemed to hang upon the very seams of the air. It was Holmes who broke it, turning not to the midwife, but to Eliza, whose posture in the chair had subtly, almost imperceptibly altered. "You may spare yourself the effort," said Holmes quietly, "for the theatre has concluded its final act." Eliza's mouth tightened. Her hands, resting on the carved arms of the chair, gave a single tremor. "Mrs. Daltrey," Holmes continued, addressing the old woman without shifting his gaze from Eliza, "was not summoned here merely to confirm your bloodline. She was also witness to something else, something you believed long forgotten, that you were never afflicted with the condition you so convincingly displayed." Eliza's eyes flicked toward Clara. Quick, almost desperate, and then to the floor. Her hands gripped the chair's arms once more, but it was Holmes who reached beneath the cushion and with a deft turn released a hidden lever. A low hiss sounded. The chair tilted slightly backwards of its own accord. "Custom made," said Holmes. "Weighted springs beneath the padding to create resistance with every movement. Devised not to support a paralytic woman, but to create the illusion of deadened limbs. Ingenious in its way, but only so long as no one asked why the wheels bore signs of recent moisture when it hadn't rained in days." Eliza's voice, when it came, was ragged with fury. "You think you know everything!" She spat, and slowly, terribly, she stood. The effect upon the room was cataclysmic. Clara choked on a sob. Isabel muttered a prayer beneath her breath. Only Holmes remained still. "I know only what was meant to remain hidden," he replied, "until you chose to walk." When Eliza sank once more into the chair, this time of her own volition, Holmes allowed the silence to settle before he spoke again, his tone not cruel, but unyieldingly precise. "Let us now speak plainly," he said, turning toward Fenley, who stood at the edge of the fireplace as if nailed to the panelling. "You knew, didn't you? Not all the details, perhaps, but enough. You knew Eliza was not the Colonel's child." Fenley gave no answer, but the look of weary resignation on his face was answer enough. Holmes turned back to the others. "Eliza was born not to the master of this house, but to his younger brother, an impetuous man whose indiscretions were whispered about but never publicly acknowledged. The child would have been an unbearable scandal had she remained within London society. Instead, she was brought here, passed into the household, and raised as a fourth daughter. For a time, she believed the story herself." He glanced toward the woman in the chair. "But time and blood are not so easily fooled. When the Colonel died and the will was read, Eliza alone was omitted. The law, so fond of bloodlines, recognized no claim from a niece born out of wedlock. She became a cousin by charity, not by law. And charity," Holmes added with quiet emphasis, "is not a sturdy inheritance." Eliza met his gaze squarely. There was pain in her eyes, yes, but also a kind of bitter triumph. "And so," Holmes said, "a sister's fall was made to look like an accident." Holmes turned to the others now, his voice low and unwavering. There was no need for drama. The truth, once known, was theatre enough. Judith, by all accounts, was a woman of habit. Every evening she took her draught, a mild soporific prescribed by Dr. Atherton, but in the days before her death, that same draught was replaced. The dosage was altered, not to harm her, but to deepen her slumber. Clara flinched. "She seemed drowsier," she murmured, "but I thought it was her nerves." "Precisely what Miss Eliza wished you to think," said Holmes. "The change was gradual, subtle. It allowed her to enter Judith's room by night, through the crawl space Mrs. Daltrey confirmed had remained accessible all these years." He moved again to the bookshelf. "That night the song began, low, familiar. The same lullaby Eliza had sung to Judith in childhood. Clara heard it, as did Isabel on another occasion, but only Judith, half-drugged, heard it clearly and feared it." Holmes pointed to the damaged section of the bed frame. "Once Judith was fully under, Eliza used the hidden door, positioned the wheelchair marks by the bed, and—" he gestured with one hand, mimicking the force of a push. "Let gravity and angle do the rest." Fenley drew a sharp breath. Isabel looked away. The scene was staged as a tragic stumble. The lullaby was never sung again, but it had done its work. A ghost had been invented to hide the killer's tread. And Holmes added softly, "Not all hauntings require spirits. Some are born of memory and move on wheels." As the constable Holmes had requested days before arrived and led Eliza gently from the room, the woman did not resist. But just before she passed beneath the gaze of the ancestral portraits, she stopped and turned. "She never feared death," she said hoarsely. Only forgetting. She used to say it, over and over, as though memory itself made her noble. No one answered. Clara stared at the floor. Isabel had left the room. Holmes stepped toward the wall and studied the great oil painting that loomed above the hearth. Judith, at the age of 16, sat in the foreground, a girl of solemn brow and delicate mouth, painted with that almost unbearable optimism peculiar to youthful portraits. Holmes stared for a moment longer, then lifted a candlestick from the side table and held it close to the canvas. There, beneath the surface varnish, one could just make out a faint scratch, a near obliterated name once written and half scraped away. It was not Judith's. She fought to be remembered, Holmes said at last, because her life was not entirely hers to live. The family gave her place, but not peace. Clara looked up. Her voice, when it came, trembled. But she was kind. She was, Holmes said. The constable's voice echoed from the foyer, calling for the carriage. Eliza's footsteps disappeared down the corridor. Holmes returned the candlestick to its place and picked up the diary. Memory, he said almost to himself, resists even the sharpest blade. One may erase names, but never impressions. And with that, the room fell still once more. Only the portrait remained watching, unblinking, silent, and somehow newly alive. The morning that followed our grim revelation was of the cold, grey sort peculiar to the English fens, where the air seems to forget warmth, and even the light carries a certain pallor. The constable had returned at first light, a man of quiet efficiency, as though the nature of the arrest required no spectacle. Eliza descended the main staircase unaccompanied, walking without the chair that had been her shield for so long. Her countenance bore no trace of defeat. Holmes and I stood near the threshold as she approached, and though her eyes swept briefly over the room, she paused, not until she reached the hallway where Judith's portrait once hung. The damage from the blade remained, a jagged fissure cutting across the smile painted so many years before. Eliza turned toward it, and I thought for a moment she might weep. But no. Her lips curved, not warmly, but with the distant satisfaction of one who has lost everything and yet surrendered nothing. I was the shadow they never saw, she murmured, more to herself than to us. And now, they'll forget the light as well. Holmes inclined his head, not in agreement, but in grim acknowledgement. Shadows, he replied softly, always believe themselves invisible until the day they fall across a corpse. She said no more. The constable opened the carriage door, and she stepped inside without resistance, folding her gloved hands as though preparing for a church service rather than a journey toward prison. The wheels turned, and thus ended the masquerade of the sister who never was. Later that day, a separate carriage arrived, this one more gently appointed, its livery clean but unostentatious. Clara descended the front steps slowly, aided by the housekeeper, her hands trembling as though each rail she touched might vanish beneath her fingers. There was no crowd to witness her departure, no farewell but our silent regard from the drawing-room window. Isabel stood at a discreet distance, neither offering nor refusing comfort. The space between the two women was greater, somehow, than the steps that separated them. Clara did not look back. Her eyes remained fixed on the road ahead as the carriage pulled away, the sea-bound wind rising in uncertain gusts. The sanatorium on the coast, recommended by Dr. Atherton, promised a regimen of calm and seclusion. But there was no treatment, I thought, for a betrayal written in lullabies and whispered through walls. She will recover, I said to Holmes, though even to my ears the words rang hollow. Holmes merely glanced at the long windows, his fingers steepled. Recovery, he murmured, is not always a return. Sometimes it is only the removal of the memory's sharpest edges. The carriage dwindled into the mist. Isabel remained standing long after it had gone. Then, without a word, she turned back toward the house, pausing briefly to rest her hand on the stone balustrade. A gesture, perhaps of farewell, or perhaps of reluctant ownership. One could not be certain. She entered the doorway alone. The door closed behind her with the weight of inheritance rather than welcome. It was 2 days later, in the stillness of a low-lit morning, that we encountered Isabel once more. Holmes had returned to the estate briefly to retrieve a final set of notes, and I accompanied him into the library where she sat alone, the will open upon the desk before her, its black ribbon now untied. She acknowledged us with a faint nod, then placed a wax seal beside the parchment with mechanical care. The solicitor had come and gone. The manor, lands, and remaining finances, modest but not insignificant, were now hers, uncontested and complete. "I thought," she said after a long pause, "that when this moment came, I would feel some sort of triumph, some clarity." Her voice was neither bitter nor resigned, only strangely hollow. "But the house has grown quiet in the wrong way, not peaceful, just emptied." Holmes made no comment. He had, I believe, already read the weight behind her composure. "I know Judith was difficult," she went on, her fingers tracing a line upon the desk's polished edge. "She wielded memory like a blade, but now, with Clara gone, with Eliza—" She trailed off. Holmes regarded her steadily. "The one left behind," he said at last, "carries not only the key, but the dust on the threshold." Isabel closed the will. "I never wanted the key," she said. She stood, not waiting for farewell, and walked once more into the hall of portraits, those silent witnesses whose painted eyes had watched it all, and remembered more than they revealed. We remained at Sycamore Hollow that evening, at Holmes's suggestion, not out of necessity, but for something more difficult to define. The storm had passed, the carriage had departed, and yet a residue of silence clung to the house, as though it too had lost its voice. Holmes stood once more in the drawing room, his gaze fixed not upon the estate's new mistress, nor the documents sealed within the library, but upon a thing less animate and yet more telling, the portrait of Judith. It had not been repaired. The gash, delivered with such deliberation, remained visible even in the waning light, a ragged slice running diagonally across the painted mouth, where once a faint smile had hovered. That smile, half regal, half elusive, seemed now reduced to a scar. I watched Holmes in silence for some time, before venturing the question that had lodged itself in my mind since the discovery. Why deface the portrait, Holmes? The crime was done, the inheritance gained. What purpose could the blade have served? He did not turn. "There are wounds meant not to obscure, but to silence," he replied. Then, in a tone almost too low to catch, she struck the only part that ever smiled at her. Holmes remained motionless before the canvas, his hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette outlined by the low gleam of a side lamp left burning. I stepped nearer, compelled not only by the portrait itself, but by the force of his thoughts as they began to take form. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he said at length, "how envy does not always turn its gaze upon jewels or titles, but rather upon that which cannot be claimed, grace." I followed his eyes to the painting. Judith was, by all reports, not kind, not particularly beloved. And yet in this image, taken in the years before suspicion and solitude hardened her face, she smiled, not by force of habit nor social obligation, but truly, easily. He glanced toward the shadows cast upon the far wall. Eliza could rehearse every limp, every glance, every cadence of her supposed sister. But this, he gestured lightly toward the canvas, this was not something she could counterfeit. It was a relic of authenticity, a smile painted from within. I was struck by the poignancy of his observation. To destroy it, Holmes went on, was not merely to erase Judith, but to challenge her claim to joy. Eliza, denied it in life, would deny it in memory. The logic was cruel, but it was sound. Holmes exhaled softly. In the end, he said, we imitate shadows, but smiles, those are earned. Dusk had descended over Sycamore Hollow, a slow and patient dusk, more akin to a withdrawal than a setting. The air, though still, held that peculiar weight found in rooms where truths have recently been spoken aloud. Holmes and I took our place near the tall window that overlooked the gravel path, now void of wheels, voices, or consequence. He struck a match and lit his pipe with deliberate calm, as though rekindling not merely tobacco, but some interior meditation. The scent mingled with the faint aroma of dust and lavender, still clinging to the old drapes. Outside, the skeletal branches of the sycamores waved ever so slightly in the breeze, their shadows drawing shapes along the stone facade of the house. Shapes not unlike fingers, tracing out forgotten names. I broke the silence. You've seen many families torn apart, Holmes, but this one, it feels different. Less malicious, perhaps. More like a tragedy performed in slow motion. He nodded, tapping a length of ash against the windowsill. Because it is not the murder that astonishes, he said, nor even the deceit. It is the illusion of closeness, the fiction of kinship. He drew upon the pipe once more. Eliza was raised as a sister, loved as a sister, betrayed like a sister, and yet never named one, not truly. And in that absence resentment grew, not from what she lacked, but from what she could never be. He looked at me then, calm, reflective. Sometimes, he said, the greatest mystery is who we call family. And as the ash scattered in the wind, so too did the final thread of the case dissolve. Not with a bang, but with a sigh. The portrait still hung. The smile remained broken. But memory, as Holmes had once told me, resists even the sharpest blade. As the echo of Eliza's footsteps faded down the corridor, Holmes remained at the window, his gaze resting not on the garden below, but upon the pale ash settling in the sill's groove. She destroyed the smile because it was the one thing she could never counterfeit, he said quietly. Deceit can mimic grief, mimic loyalty, even virtue, but joy, Watson, true joy is never born of a lie. He turned to me, eyes solemn. And so we are left not with villains, but with wounds handed down like heirlooms. In such households, murder is often the last inheritance. What do you believe drove Eliza more deeply? Envy of Judith's inheritance, or the haunting fear of being forgotten altogether? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd be keen to read your view. If this mystery intrigued you, do like, subscribe for more Holmes cases, and pass it along to a fellow admirer of shadows and deduction.